Good afternoon. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Commission to welcome Fareed Zakaria, host of CNN's world-renowned program Global, GPS, and American Thought Leader, for our third panel on the future of international technology cooperation. Please welcome Mr. Zakaria and the panel.
Thank you so much. It is a huge honor to be here. This is such important work the Commission is doing. The report is one that I think all of us read with a great deal of interest. It's one of those rare government reports that really pointed to a very important issue with extraordinary intelligence. I'm going to get out of the way as quickly as I can because we have an extraordinary panel to talk about the future of international technology cooperation. We're joined by Madeleine Albright, who is one of America's legendary statesmen, having served as Secretary of State, the first female Secretary of State, in addition to being ambassador to the UN, having worked at the National Security Council and taught at various universities. And she continues to teach at Georgetown. Nadia Schadlow, who is a former Deputy National Security Advisor, also very distinguished scholar and expert, and Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Anders Fogh Rasmussen was Secretary General of NATO and was also Prime Minister of Denmark, among many other positions. Having gotten all those very impressive resumes out of the way, I thought what I'd do is start by asking Secretary Albright to talk about the issue of cooperation in general. And the reason I pose it to you, Madeleine, is because you tried mightily, and in some ways you were the beginning of the post-Cold War efforts to create a new alliance and greater degree of cooperation among the world's democracies. And many people worried at the time that the democracies wouldn't really come together, that what had brought them together was the Soviet threat, and that without that, just the idea of values was not a strategic glue that was strong enough. So describe what you learned and why you feel so strongly about the idea of democracies cooperating in this new world.
Well, thank you, Fareed, and I'm delighted to be on this panel with Anders and Nadia. We know each other and we look forward to an interesting discussion. The 90s really were remarkable, and I started them out at the United Nations, where obviously there are many democracies, but also non-aligned states that were unclear about where they were going, and the Security Council itself, where we had, it was called Russia by then, and China, and how they dealt. And so it was a time to talk about democracy. By the way, President Clinton is the first one to use the term indispensable about the United States. I just used it so often it became identified with me. But there's nothing about the word that means alone. It is basically partnerships. That is what the whole concept was based on, and how we can work with others to look at what were the major issues out there to deal with. And some of them had to do with the fact that there were many new countries, also that we were dealing still with issues that were remnants of the war in Iraq, and how to deal with those that we called rogue states, and then how we were dealing with the countries that had been part of the Soviet Union, and those, frankly, that were just basket cases that we couldn't bring into the system at the time, believe it or not, Somalia and Haiti. And so we were very focused on democracies. Then, when I became Secretary of State, we talked even more about how to get democracies together and how NATO, in fact, could be expanded, because it's not only a military alliance, but an alliance of democracies. And so we developed a way of the Partnership for Peace to work together. And then also what we did, I created something called the Community of Democracies, which met in Warsaw, because the then Foreign Minister of Warsaw, of Poland, Bronislaw Geremek, wanted the adjective Warsaw associated with something other than the pact. But the issue was, and it's something that has to be considered now, we didn't know whether we would invite everybody. What was the definition of democracy? And part of it was, in fact, to share best practices. So there was a deliberate attempt to really work with democracies, whether through the alliance structure, whether those that might be coming into the EU, those in the United Nations, and those with whom the United States just had bilateral relations. It was very much a theme.
And what was your, what lesson did you draw from that Warsaw meeting, which I remember well? I was there at the time. And it really was this extraordinary gathering of countries from all over the world, all trying to figure out their position in a new post-Cold War environment.
Well, I think that it was trying to figure out who wanted what, and then how we would continue our work, how we would cooperate, what we had in common, and in fact, best practices. And we had worked out a way that different countries would share the community of democracies in alternative years. It worked for a while, but I really do think there continued to be the question of how to keep the momentum up and how to deal in a world, frankly, that I think had in the 21st century some mega trends and their downside. And just to quickly mention those, the first mega trend is globalization, from which we benefited all very much. But the problem was that globalization is faceless. And so people wanted to know their identities, which we all do want to know. But when my identity hates somebody else's identity, it creates nationalism and hyper-nationalism, and that undermines democracy. Then there was technology, which obviously did incredible things to unite people. And I love to talk about the Kenyan woman farmer who no longer had to walk miles to pay her bills. She could, in fact, pay them with her mobile phone, and she could then participate politically in her country. But the downside was that the information was de-aggregated, social media entered in, people didn't know where they were getting their information, and that divided people. And finally, there was the Internet of Things, when your toaster talks to you or whatever, and that might be fun, but it did create more fragmentation. And I think those are the issues that, as the Biden administration is thinking about a summit for democracy instead of democracies, how they are dealing with those challenges and their downsides.
Anders, what is your perspective on this, looking at these same issues? And to what extent do you think we are entering a world kind of divided between the democracies on the one side and the autocracies on the other? Or is that the wrong way to think about the world?
No, I think it is an existential question, because my generation had the fortune to thrive in the globe of what has been called the shining city on a hill. But the question is, will future generations have to survive under the shadow of digital authoritarianism? And let me stress, we need determined American global leadership to counter the world's autocracies. But the US cannot compete with and counter the global technology ambitions of authoritarian rivals if it acts alone. Like-minded countries must work together to protect open societies and promote freedom and democracy. To that end, we need a strong technology cooperation between the world's free societies to set the international norms and standards for the use of emerging technologies. That's why I strongly endorse the recommendations from the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence to build an emerging technology coalition of allies and partners to promote the design, development, and use of emerging technologies according to democratic norms and values. And I also support launching an international digital democracy initiative to develop, promote, and fund technologies that comport with democratic values and ethical norms around openness, privacy, security, and reliability. And I would suggest that the United States mobilize its NATO partners and reach out to the European Union to develop these alliances and initiatives. The newly established EU-US Trade and Technology Council is a very important step in that direction. However, it's important to include democracies across the globe, and I would suggest to make the building of a technological alliance of democracies a topic at the upcoming Global Summit for Democracy that President Biden has pledged to organize and host.
Let me ask you, Anders, how this squares and how should we think about the issue when you think about globalization, free trade, and the opportunities that that provides. I know you are, for example, an ardent free trader. Denmark, your country, is very much part of at the center of global trade flows. And yet, what you are talking about is a kind of protectionism, is it not? How to think about this issue of technology cooperation among the democracies, but at the same time taking place within a highly globalized, open, and interdependent economy and trading system?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And you're quite right. As a point of departure, I am really a free trader. I believe that free trade, I believe that open societies, I do believe that free flow information benefit all of us. I think globalization is a very positive and a very, very good thing. However, I don't think the Chinese, for instance, have played by the rules. And we shouldn't be naive. And this is the reason why I think the world's free societies need to get together and put pressure on the world's autocracies. We should recall that if all the world's free societies get together, we represent more than 60% of the global economy. That's a formidable force that will create respect in Beijing. So I do believe that we need to put more pressure on the autocracies. And this is the reason why, in a way, I think the world's democracies should offer each other preferential treatment. We should engage in free trade agreements. We should agree on a number of global norms and standards for free data flow, for privacy, etc. Hopefully, that pressure will force the Chinese and other autocracies to abide by certain global norms that respect freedom and democracy. I think this is the only way.
Nadia, what are your thoughts on listening to this conversation about democracy, technology, and the tensions, and the opportunities and the tensions?
Well, thank you, Fareed. I think, look, we need to step back for a moment and consider some of our assumptions. And one that I hold going into this is that technology is not neutral for the most part. Technology and the discussion we're having is because technology is being used in the service of politics, in the service of economic systems, in the service of national security. And if you hold that assumption, you come to some different policy outcomes. So cooperation is definitely, in my view, necessary among the democracies. And as Secretary Albright and Anders pointed out, there are all different mechanisms for doing this. But I think as we think about cooperation, we have to be very focused on outcomes. We have to be wary of unwieldy, extraordinarily complex multilateral processes that actually work against, in some cases, what we want to achieve, right? We can't afford to spend 5 years negotiating agreements so that to achieve certain outcomes, because by then it will be too late, right? The AI Commission several times emphasized that really we're on the cusp of losing out to China in these key areas of AI and other foundational technologies. So we need to consider cooperation, but in a way that's driven with a sensitivity to time, to agility, and to perhaps certain sectors or priorities, right? We need to think about cooperation with who? With governments, the private sector, academia, universities, but also over what? What domains of cooperation do we need to prioritize? So I think while we need we need new approaches, we need to keep in mind that the broader the multilateral process, the not necessarily most effective it is. And I have some further ideas too about how, models we might use. In the early 80s, there was an organization called Sematech, which was a consortium that brought together semiconductor companies, governments, research institutions to work on specific problem sets to keep the United States ahead in the semiconductor sphere. So perhaps a consortium model could work for some of these foundational technologies in the West, as an example. But I think we need to be careful and at this point move to some of the specific modes of cooperation. And I think the Commission did a great job in identifying some of those.
Can you help us think through, Nadia, how much of this is about thwarting Chinese, or let's say, if there are theoretically Russian technologies? We've all heard about the US government going around telling countries, don't buy Huawei, don't adopt that 5G standard. And how much of it is the Sematech model, which is doing something in the United States to present an alternative, to provide a competitive alternative? With Sematech, we simply tried to create and revive the American chip industry. We weren't going around telling people don't buy in those days Japanese chips. So explain that difference, because one seems more outwardly directed and the other seems more inwardly directed.
Right. Well, I'm using the Sematech model as one that I would broaden actually to include European allies and partners. I'm using it more in a sense that it worked on a particular foundational technology in a very practical way. And I like that a lot. I think the AI Commission did a great job of describing the affirmative things we need to do to stay ahead of China. And I agree with that. But we do also need to take measures to prevent or at least slow down the growth of these key foundational technology areas in China. So I do think we're in a systemic rivalry, which is what the EU has called it, right? Which is why the EU-China trade deal was put on hold. I think we're facing a serious systemic contest here. And I do think we need the combination of proactive as well as defensive measures. And I think the Commission did a good job of balancing between the two. I'm probably less optimistic on the Commission's recommendation that there are areas of S&T where we can cooperate with the CCP. So I may be an outlier, but they captured the sense of what we need to do affirmatively as well as defensively.
Madeleine, you have actually had to do the hard work of diplomacy of this kind. And so I want to ask you, what do you think it's going to look like? Because when I look at, for example, Asia, what I'm struck by is China is the largest trading partner of every country in Asia, actually, except Bhutan. Tiny Bhutan. India is the largest trading partner. But other than that, China is the largest trading partner for every country. And they all want to grow and they all want that trade relationship. But they all, at some level, want a great trading relationship with China and a great geopolitical relationship with the United States. In other words, they want the economic benefits of a relationship with China and the geopolitical insurance policy or the security that would come from a relationship with the United States. But it seems to me that both sides, the China and the United States, are saying, well, you can't have it both ways. You cannot order a la carte on this menu. You get the prefix. If you want US geopolitics, you also have to agree to ban Huawei. And the Chinese are saying, if you want Belt and Road money, you have to allow Chinese companies in. How difficult is it going to be to get countries, and this is beyond Asia, I think European countries, Germany, 50% of Germany's exports at one point were going to China. How difficult is it going to get them to make the kind of decisions that Nadia was talking about, which are to really privilege American or Western or democratic technology over Chinese, if the Chinese say, well, the condition of doing business with us is that you also allow our companies in?
Well, I think that we are dealing with a number of simultaneous problems. I agree, with Nadia that this is the moment, and yet time is of the essence, and all that we're talking about is going to take a lot of time. We also have the issue at the moment, and as I have been listening to the discussions today and having read the report, the number of different organizations that are involved and how you even get some kind of way that they can not compete with each other, but take on various tasks. So the organizational aspect of this, I think, is very complicated. The other part, though, because by the way, I'm often asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. So I am optimistic that people are understanding this and the issues and are beginning to see that the Chinese coming in and saying, we'll build you a road and don't worry about the environmental aspects of it, that there are those who are beginning to see the true picture of what it comes with in terms of certain lack of value system that many countries really want. And so, but I am worried about the fact that we are going to lose time on this. That is really what does worry me, the complexity of it, and that we are admiring the problem rather than really dealing with some of the very specific aspects. So in meetings, I would in fact say something like, I have come a long way, so I must be frank. And I will really tell people what they're buying into when they buy into the Belt and Road in terms of the things that the Chinese are asking of them to do and the commitment that they're making, and that they don't hire people in the country, and that they're creating what is known as the debt trap. And I think that we need to find the common lines that we have with countries and various groupings. But I hope that as this discussion goes on and the report is looked at, is that what I'm worried about are the number of players in this, that are how we're going to integrate all of those things so that the Chinese who have one way approach to things will kind of work their way through our mayhem of a variety of various groupings that want to deal with issues. So we need some kind of organizational structure to this, and to remember the following thing. For me, one of the major aspects of this whole way of looking at technology cooperation is the value system that we're talking about. What are the values behind this? What is it that we are bringing to people? What is it in terms of the capability of civil society to be involved in decision-making, democracy versus authoritarianism, and really remember that this is about values inherently, and how we do manage to cooperate on that and point out the lack of the valueless system of what the Chinese are doing.
Anders, how would you respond to this? Because it really does seem to me the central question. You have a country like Denmark or really any country in the world, Brazil. China is now Brazil's largest trading partner. How do you get these countries to forego what seems economic benefit for them by having a full spectrum relationship with China? Yeah,
that's also one of the key questions. But I think at the end of the day, each and every country, each and every business will have to make a choice. And basically, I think it's not possible to have it both ways. You can't compromise on basic principles when it comes to freedom and democracy, individual liberty, respect for the rule of law. You have to make a choice. And I have spoken with many companies in recently who have had, or they still have, activities in China. Some of them have been exposed to Chinese consumer boycotts. Some of them have tried to accommodate the Chinese regime, but at the expense of their relationship with neighboring countries. Now they have been subject to consumer boycotts in those countries. You have to make a choice. So this is the reason why I do believe that, for instance, in Europe, the EU cannot pursue a position as a moderator between Washington and Beijing. You have to take a side. You have to join forces with America. And this is the reason why we have to, we need a more constructive debate in Europe on the term European autonomy, because you have to join forces with other democratic forces in the world. There is no ideological equality between America and China. No ideological equality, dictatorship and democracy. In that fight, you cannot stay neutral. You have to take sides. So that's my brutal conclusion, that you can't have it both ways. We have to create an alliance of democracies. And this is the reason why I'm looking very much forward to Biden's global summit for democracy later this year or the beginning of next year.
Nadia, do you think it will be easy to convince countries to do what Madeleine and Anders are both saying? Because I'm struck by the fact that when you talk to the next generation of German leaders, for example, they're actually more comfortable with being in the middle, playing this role between China and the United States. Merkel, in a sense, comes from an older generation, perhaps steeped in the Cold War, perhaps, having lived through communism herself, feels somewhat differently. And I find that that's true with many younger European leaders. They're aware of the economic benefits of a relationship with China.
I agree, Fareed, that it will be difficult. I do think, though, it's different if you move a little bit east, right? Countries that have a more closer recent experiences with authoritarian systems, the Poles, the Hungarians. So we tend to, so Germany's not representative of all countries in Europe, I would say, but you're right. It's going to be tough. I would recommend reading not what comes out of the United States, but what comes out of the CCP and China's leaders themselves, right? If you're reading, and there are increasing number of translations of statements over the past year about China's desire to retain autonomy over its key foundational technologies, to ensure that it is completely independent of the West, of the United States, of Europe. I mean, so I think, Fareed, you were mentioning you're going to work with a group of next generation strategic thinkers later this summer. Read what's coming out of China itself. But yeah, it will be difficult, but I agree with Anders that choices will need to be made. I think it will be easier to make those choices once people really understand what's at stake. But not everyone's there. Just this week, I was really amazed to read the story of a British semiconductor company that was just almost bought out by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. We're in the middle of the past year of this huge debate in Europe and the United States about the importance of the semiconductor industry, the microchip industry. And right under our eyes, this transaction occurs or almost occurs. And to me, I was extremely surprised by it, but it's indicative of the complexity of this and the lack of kind of a sense of shared responsibility by the private sector.
Can you talk for a second, Nadia, about that? Because it seems to me that's a very crucial component here. The private sector in both Europe and the United States, and even in Japan, by its actions, they're all big players in China, and they certainly seem to imagine. Are we talking about a completely different world in which there's not just some technological decoupling, but there's really broad-scale economic decoupling?
Well, over time, probably yes, because of the fundamental systemic differences, and because we're seeing a situation in which, as I started, technology is being used in the service of a particular political and economic system. So over time, it's harder and harder to get around that fundamental division. But unless the private sector or a lot of it comes along, I don't think we'll succeed. To Secretary Albright's point, I'm an optimist, but an optimist that's very worried. And I think it's really hard to identify ways in which the private sector can begin to think differently and to have the growth that it wants, right? The profits that it wants. But this incident with the UK semiconductor firm, I think, is a really good one, because we've been talking about this now, for a year and a half. Everyone, it seems, knows now what a microchip is, right? A year ago, most of us didn't, except for physicists and manufacturers. And the fact that this is just happening shows how hard it's going to be to actually affect real change.
I will point out, we are also witnessing one of the problems we face in this whole struggle, which is we keep telling countries not to go down the road of Chinese 5G, but we don't have a superior alternative. And I say this because I watched, while you were talking, Nadia, Anders Fogh Rasmussen's video link got cut because the connection was unstable. And, we still do not have very strong, good 5G. And, the Huawei stuff is very high quality. We have to confront the reality that I think we need a lot more investment here at home to make sure that we have alternatives, not just one alternative, but many alternatives, if we are going to try and play a kind of a game of technological competitiveness, rather than, is the way I'd like to think of it, rather than conflict. But let me ask Madeleine, if I may, Secretary Albright, something that Nadia said that, and that Anders also touched on, about the importance of this summit for democracies. And it raises an issue, which is, what is the state of democracy in the Western world itself? Nadia was talking about how when you go east, these countries have had some experience with communism or authoritarianism. It's true, in some cases, they are having very close, proximate experiences right now. When I think of Hungary, the descent of Hungary into a kind of quasi-authoritarian system seems to me very troubling. And it's also true that people like that, and certainly Viktor Orban seems to be moving in that direction, are much more comfortable making alliances with authoritarian regimes. So how worried are you about this rise of illiberal democracy or electoral authoritarianism? And do you worry that these people will find common cause with the Putins and Xis of the world?
I am worried. And by the way, you asked me initially about what we learned in the 90s. I have to say that there was such a sense of euphoria at the end of the Cold War. And I think most of you know my background. I was born in Prague and spent quite a lot of time with Václav Havel and kind of thoughts about how incredible things were in Central and Eastern Europe. I met Viktor Orban when he was everybody's favorite dissident. And there was kind of this thought that now we've got it, we figured it out. And as chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, I keep asking about what happened, what went wrong. And I think we just took too much for granted in terms of people that had lived under a system that gave them free education and jobs when neither actually were good, but they had them. And what it is that societies need. And I do think that in many ways the social contract has been broken in many countries in terms of how people are doing and what the responsibilities of government are. I do think, and there are many things obviously that appeal to me about the Biden administration, but there's a humility in terms of saying, we have to figure out what's really going on and how we operate and what are the things that need to be fixed. And I think that is very much has to be a part of this discussion. And by the way, one of the things, as I've worked abroad with NDI, there was a certain time that I said, well, democracy is based on compromise and understanding the other. And they looked at me and said, you mean like your country? And so we are not the best, have not been the best examples. And so we do need to examine, we need to understand what it is that needs to be done in rehabilitating a social contract and how you take care of societies where pandemics take place, where education is not appropriate, and by the way, where civil society doesn't have a role. And one of the reasons that I am so excited about this whole grouping is that it does have a set up some kind of standards to ask ourselves questions and to be critical and to understand that we do have to ask ourselves these hard questions, which is why it's a summit for democracy and not just those that think they already have it. We have to understand what the basis of it is, the value system, and obeying the rule of law.
Anders, let me ask you to pick up on that point that Madeleine was making about the reference she made to American democracy. Part of the premise of all of this is that the United States can lead a global democratic response to techno-authoritarianism, let's call it that. How worried are you? You haven't weighed in on whether you're like Madeleine and Nadia, an optimist who worries. How worried are you that the strength of American democracy, the strength of American society, is going to be part of the problem here? As our country's willing to look at the United States with its various dysfunctions, Trump and the like, and say we want to follow. How comfortable are you with America as a world leader today?
I'm very comfortable, and I'm an optimist. I'm not that worried. And first of all, who should be the alternative? I mean, the only leader of the free world can be the United States. No other has the global reach to exercise such a global leadership, and still, despite all deficiencies, the American democracy is basically solid and sound, and I think most people in the world are looking to the United States as an example. Of course, you also have to exercise an ideological leadership, and this is why it's of utmost importance that the political leadership of the United States stands as a symbol, an exemplary symbol for freedom and democracy. Of course, the political leader of the United States should not cozy up with autocrats, as we saw in the previous 4-year term. And this is the reason why I'm very optimistic about the Biden presidency, because we know that President Biden is strongly committed to respect for human rights, basic democratic principles, and he has already spoken in plain language to the world's autocrats. So basically, I'm an optimist. I do believe that America can exercise this leadership of the free world. This is also why the administration should not postpone this summit for this global summit for democracy. Is being pledged to be organized by the end of this year. Maybe that's unrealistic now, but I think in a few months' time and at the beginning of 2022 at the latest, Biden should organize and host this summit.
Nadia, let me ask you to pick up on something you mentioned in your last remarks, because it seems to me that we're now getting at sort of the pieces of a strategy, but one crucial piece of it has to be about the private sector. And are you comfortable, are you confident that democratic governments have the tools necessary to be able to find a kind of national competitive strategy that allows it to be a robust alternative to techno-authoritarianism, or do we need a fundamentally new way of thinking about it? I ask this because I'm struck by the fact that I was reading an article about what happened in China with the Didi, China's version of Uber, and the speed with which Didi has fallen. And one of the points it was making is many of the Chinese regulators' concerns about these tech companies are not that different from the concerns that European regulators and American regulators are beginning to have about big tech companies. But the big difference is China has no process. They have no intervening steps. Even if you wanted to do something like this in the United States, you'd have to change laws, you'd have to change regulations. There'd be review processes. The companies would be able to appeal. It would all go to courts. That would take years. Whereas in China, they told the Didi, we're just taking you off the App Store, right? I don't mean to say, do we need to emulate China here? But I really want to hear what you think about this relationship between the government and the private sector, because this is so critical. And unlike the Cold War, so much of this competition is operating in the private realm, and so how do we think about that?
That's a lot. That's a lot to read. Okay.
And you have 4 minutes.
Exactly. Well, first, I do want to say that I'm happy that Anders is an optimist because it gives me more optimism. So I'm really happy to hear about that. But I think fundamentally, we would still, your point, Fareed, is interesting. We would still be having this conversation today, and the AI Commission would be just as important today, even absent China or Russia or any other competitor out there, right? Because we're fundamentally talking about the power of digital technologies and their relationship with democracy, right? Neil Ferguson's book, The Tower and the Square, does a really good job of talking about that. And he's not, optimistic in the end, right? This digital revolution has implications for democracies, no matter what the conversation is about China or other countries. Look, I think we're struggling, and this goes back to, does the government need to be directive in this domain, or does it need to incentivize and provide the frameworks so that companies can operate responsibly? I'd like to think the latter, right? I tend to think more regulation is not the way to go, but clearly companies, for that to work and to get to outcomes that are healthy for democracy, outcomes in which individual liberties thrive, we need companies to do their part and show a willingness to want to achieve those outcomes as well. And I think some of these big tech companies in the United States have not really shown that willingness yet, quite frankly, right? The individual is not given the power in these companies, right? You have to go in and change settings and do things to protect your individual rights. The default is not the opposite. So I think it can work, but we need to better understand why companies aren't being more forthcoming in this domain. But my sense is more regulation is not the ideal way to do it, but the right incentives and that sort of model is probably the tax benefit model. I mean, a lot of what the Biden administration is doing in supporting some of the recent acts in Congress, the U.S. Innovation and Competitiveness Act, which absorbed the CHIPS Act. This is R&D, a government role for basic research and development. Yes, right? But then it becomes more complex as you move on and down that value chain. But ultimately, companies need to show that they're on board for democracy.
But that's if I can just push you, that's a tough thing. Part of being a democracy is the government can't control companies in that way, or can they?
No, but what I'm saying is the government shouldn't have to. Private sector companies that have benefited from the flourishing of democracy and capitalism in this country should be on the right side of that and should, recalibrate some of their ideas about short-term processes, go a little bit longer, think of a little bit longer, R&D, investments, where they are located. There are things that are in companies' control. I'm not the only one talking about this, right? This is a long conversation about how the US stock market promotes short-termism over long-term. So companies can and should do more. And I think companies, there are roles for leaders out there to do that. But they've benefited from this system, so they have a responsibility to protect and ensure the flourishing of our system as well.
Fareed, could I just jump in terms of saying,
course.
I think part of the issue is the private sector has to be at the table earlier and to really be able to participate in a discussion instead of kind of having the legislation there and then kind of be told, fill it out that way. It's been my experience that there are a lot of private companies that would like to see some rules of the game, especially as they are working with companies in Europe and some of the questions that are out there. And they need to be at the table early. That has been my main thing that I've been talking about more and more. This is not such a division of labor, but really working together.
Yeah, that's a terrific point. Matt, if I can enlist your help here, I know that there are people in the hall who'd like to ask questions, and I don't want to deprive them of the opportunity. If you can maybe find a way to get us some questions from the audience, that'd be great, or from anyone online.
Any questions in the audience? Feel free to raise your hand. We have roving mics. And Mr. Zakaria, you should be able to see virtual questions on your screen. There's a question in the back here.
Do we have a question, or?
Are there any other questions? We'll try. Okay.
Right.
Fareed, the mic's not working here. We want to go to
all right.
the question.
This is again part of our technology challenge right here at home. Anders, I saw you had your hand up. So is there something you want to add?
The mic is live again, so apologies.
Just an idea. We're speaking about private companies and how they will be subject to suppression from authoritarian regimes. I think we should consider introducing what I would call an economic Article 5. Obviously, my idea is very much inspired by my position as NATO Secretary General for 5 years, where we have a security Article 5, which states that an attack on one ally is considered an attack on all allies. I think the free world should introduce a similar Article 5 on economic issues. That is, if, for instance, a company or a country is subject to sanctions or other retaliatory measures from China, then we will all help that company or that country, providing credit facilities, introducing free trade agreements, etc., etc. I think that could be a very forceful mechanism to prevent authoritarian pressure on companies and free societies.
We have a
That's
question.
that's a terrific point. Matt, have we managed to fix the mic? I do want to make this somewhat participatory.
We have a virtual question.
In the spirit of democracy.
Sure.
So I do want to let others in here.
Sure, I'll raise you one and we'll go virtual democracy with a question from the virtual audience. I'll paraphrase the question real briefly. It seems like many are waiting for a Sputnik moment to create political will for meaningful change.
Matt, you got to talk louder.
Sure. It seems like we're waiting for a Sputnik moment to create the political will for change. Is anyone on the panel afraid of a Pearl Harbor moment instead?
That's a great point. I mean, I think this is one of the things Eric Schmidt talks about when he's been trying to get people to understand the urgency here. That these are trends. There is no one event. There isn't one day that China will overtake the United States in AI, and that's part of what makes this difficult, right, Madeleine?
Yes, absolutely. And so there's, by the way, when I wrote my book on fascism, the best quote came from Mussolini. Sometimes a chicken is plucked one feather at a time. And what we've seen is a lot of one feather plucking. And so that moment is not really there. Although I have to say, reading the paper today, where all of a sudden there are those in China that are not able to use their charge cards in order to get all kinds of things that they want delivered, et cetera. They're worried about how that's working. And the question is whether the Chinese are going to step in and use that information to limit their consumerism, which is what is making China work at the moment. So there could be this thought that China will overdo. But I do think we should be approaching a Sputnik moment. And I think that this kind of a discussion and the possibilities bring us closer to it, because it really does identify that we cannot do this alone. There is no way, and I appreciate what Anders was saying about the United States. I am definitely an optimistic, grateful American, but we cannot do this alone. And the basis of all of this is how we get the kind of cooperation now on creating a system with values in it, where we can agree on the values that come with free trade, rule of law, lack of corruption, et cetera. That's why I think this is an important discussion now.
Matt, do you have any more questions for us from the floor?
Sure, we'll take another swing back here in the corner.
Naturally, you work on digital technology, so the mic didn't work. I'm at USAID, Paul Nelson. Could you speak a little bit to the developing country context a little bit more? You mentioned we can't do this alone, Madam Secretary. And I think frequently countries in Africa, across Latin America, Southeast Asia are overlooked or perhaps perceived as being remote actors at this point in time when it comes to AI and the deployment of AI in those countries. But they're prevalent and rapidly increasing in use in both positive and negative ways. So could you speak a little bit to how we extend support for democratic values in the AI context in those markets?
Madeleine, you want to take? I mean,
I do think that we have to consider that most of the world lives in those parts of the world, and that whatever issues that we are working on have to have the kinds of discussions that we're talking about take place there, in terms of trying to figure out how to have some of these groupings make very clear that they have to be talking about the developing world. Whether it's on health issues or economic issues or technology issues, we cannot just ignore it. That is at obviously our own expense, and we need to do that for sure.
Anders, do you want to weigh in on this? Because it does seem to me it's an important point. A lot of this is going to manifest itself in the so-called developing world or third world. Many of these governments like the idea of being able to use digital technologies and AI to better monitor their people. I worry even about democracies like India, Turkey, where the governments have become increasingly willing to use technology to stifle opposition.
Yeah, but that is a real challenge. Artificial intelligence can be used to make our life easier. It can be used to increase liberty, personal liberty, actually, but it can also be misused to control and supervise people. And this is the reason why it's so important to implement the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence proposal to launch a democracy initiative. Because what we need is actually ideally, it's an international convention on the use of emerging technologies. But I'm not naive. I don't think it's possible to get China, Russia, and other autocratic regimes on board in such a global convention. So this is the reason why I think the world's democracies should agree on certain principles for the use of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. That would be a first important step, and then follow up by giving each other preferential treatment.
Nadia,
I just wanted to make one point in that the gentleman who asked the question from USAID, I don't know this definitely, but my sense is that the United States shifted from a model of development that began to de-emphasize infrastructure, right? And I think that we need to shift back quickly. So that is why, I mean, we've seen the advantages of Belt Road Initiative because it was nuts and bolts. It is nuts and bolts infrastructure. And over time, I think for many reasons, the US shifted away from that model of development, driving that. Now with the Development Finance Corporation and new tools and an export-import bank that's operating with more flexibility. But it's, again, time matters. And so how can we provide more of the infrastructure and the frameworks needed? You know, whether it's the cell phones that Secretary Albright mentioned being so important to the Kenyan farmer. But I think that's a key issue to think about going forward.
I'm going to close by asking Madeleine, you know, foreign policy is rarely made on the basis of kind of strategies and grand thinking. It's a series of reactions to crises. And I think one of the questioners asked, could there be a Pearl Harbor? The Pearl Harbor we're likely to see is going to be a massive cyber attack of some kind or the other, probably at not non-military but critical infrastructure. Madeleine, if something like that happens, does that have the effect of maybe actually bringing us all together and trying to find a way forward? You know, what do you think the dynamic would be if we did wake up one morning and realize that we had a massive power outage through half the United States, or you know, some major attack on critical infrastructure, and it had come from some non-state actor somewhere in the world?
Well, it obviously would be a horrendous moment, but we can't wait for that. I really do think that one of the things, just to go back to the president's trip, having built on the fact that he found agreement among the countries of the G7 and the EU and NATO, and then went and met with Putin and laid out the issue of the cyber aspect of it. And I think that that was a very clear message, and that has to be followed up. We cannot have a horrendous event, the kind of which you're talking about. 9/11 woke us up, but I think that we didn't deal with a lot of the aspects of it. And the US government, and I do think the discussion here has been, and during the day, important, because the things that have to be dealt with now are whole of government by the United States. We all have to be looking at where the issues are coming from and working together on that. And I think that the event you're describing might in fact put an end to more than one, generally so terminal that it would be impossible to recover. And so I think we need to be more prepared and to take it step by step with what we have now, and an administration that I think what they laid down in terms of the cyber issues was one of the really important conclusions or work plan that came out of the president's trip, which gave me a lot of optimism in terms of how we were going to move forward with our friends and allies.
Yeah, it's the beginnings of some kind of deterrence system that has to be put in place to deal with cyber attacks, it seems to me. This has been an absolutely terrific conversation. And again, I want to thank the AI Commission for putting out such an important report, for hosting such an important set of discussions. This really has changed the debate in Washington in a way that very few things do. Let's just hope we keep talking about this and that talk then translates into action. And as Madeleine Albright said, action before the crisis rather than in the heat and wake of a crisis. Thank you all so much. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.